Okay, this is Siva. He's going to tell us about his MSc research and about his context processing in schizophrenia.
Thank you. Well, bad color for this talk I'm going to do, unfortunately. Yeah, so I'm interested in context processing in schizophrenia. So I'm just going to talk a little bit today about some research me and Bill have been doing over the last year. So here's an overview of my talk. Since I'm interested in context processing in schizophrenia, a useful place to start is defining what is schizophrenia, first of all. Then saying a little bit about what our conception of context is. Then very briefly I'll cover some of the literature and previous research that's shown there's a reduced sensitivity to context in schizophrenia. And then I'll tell you what we did, the task we used, what we found or didn't find, and what it all means. So what is schizophrenia? Well, it's a chronic mental disorder. It affects about 1% of the global population. And it has its onset normally in early adulthood, about your 20s, early 20s. It's characterized by three main syndromes. So if you put in the signs and symptoms of schizophrenia into factor analysis, these are the dimensions that come out. Reality distortion, which includes hallucinations, hearing voices, delusions, thinking the CIA is going to kill you. As long as the CIA isn't actually going to kill you, it's a delusion. Psychomotor poverty. So this is really social withdrawal. Reduced emotional responses, reduced motor activity to the point, the extreme point of catatonia. And finally, disorganization. This is really a prototypical idea of a crazy schizophrenic. Incoherent speech, inappropriate behavior, bizarre dress, non-sept, the works. This is really the stereotype of a schizophrenic. So that's schizophrenia. What do we mean by context and context processing? Well, this is Bill Phillips and Steve Silverstein's operationalized definition of context. Basically, they distinguish a primary input from context by saying a primary input determines the various interpretations of a stimulus, while context affects the salience of all these various interpretations. I'll give you an example of contextual disambiguation that hopefully makes this a little bit clearer. So say you have an ambiguous figure here. It can be the letter O. It can be the number 0. It's ambiguous. Various interpretations. So what does context do? Well, it modulates the salience of these interpretations. So here, the context is a flanking letters T and P, or the flanking numbers 2 and 4. Now, they don't actually change the objective physical properties of this ambiguous item. All they do is influence how you process it, and interpret it. So context isn't really changing the item, it's just changing how you process it and how you interpret it. So specifically talking about visual context, which is what I'm mainly interested in, in order for context to influence how you interpret this ambiguous item, subsumed within this contextual processing is a prior step of perceptual grouping. Now, why is this important? Well, if you don't organize a visual scene, if you don't group the local elements with the context in which they occur, then the context isn't going to influence how you process the ambiguous item. So if you saw the T, the ambiguous item, and the P as individual, independent, separate items, the context will affect your interpretation of that ambiguous item. So how do you group a visual scene? How do you organize it? How do you group local elements to their context? Well, you do it by Gestalt principles. From the good old Gestalt psychologists who had these principles of similarity. Things that look the same will be grouped together. Proximity, things that are close to each other will be grouped together. Principles like closure. So you'll want to fill the gaps in an incomplete figure to form a coherent whole or a gestalt. Now, there's some evidence that schizophrenics have problems with this. This quote from schizophrenic, "Everything I see is split up. It's like a photograph that's torn in bits." It gives a good idea of the phenomenological experience of this fragmentation, this impaired perceptual organization that they live with. Now, experimental tests explicitly show that there are deficits in perceptual grouping. For instance, contour integration, broken line drawings, they involve visual code, complete the task. And schizophrenics are impaired with this relative to normals. Numerosity tasks involve perceptual grouping based on principles of similarity, sometimes proximity, and schizophrenics also show impairments relative to controls. Now, this is important. Impaired perceptual organization is primarily associated with disorganized symptomatology. So remember, reality distortions like motor property disorganization. It's mainly disorganized schizophrenics who predominantly show these impaired perceptual organization problems. And it really makes sense because disorganized symptomatology is mainly incoherent speech. And context can be seen to operate at the level of language production. You know, independent words, independent themes need to be linked together and integrated into a context to form coherent arguments or coherent sentences in terms of syntactic structure. So it's unsurprising to see that fragmentation at the level of visual perception links in with fragmentation at the level of symptomatology and speech production. So although we have evidence that impaired perceptual organization, vision, and speech production are related, we don't really know anything about speech comprehension. So what I wanted to do, and what we both wanted to do, is look at how visual context processing, linguistic comprehension specifically, and disorganized symptomatology are all interrelated. And in clinical correlates have just been seeing if all these impaired visual context processing deficits are related to disorganization specifically rather than schizophrenia in general. What do I mean by superiority strategy? Well, the problem with a lot of the previous research is they demonstrate visual context impairments by saying, well, the schizophrenics will crap at this test compared to normals. Now, they interpret this as saying, well, there's a specific cognitive deficit in perceptual organization, when really the performance disadvantage can be explained by chronic understimulation as a result of institutionalization or just poor motivation, all these general cognitive deficits and unrelated confounds. So by superiority strategy, we hope to show that perceptual organization can manifest as a performance advantage in certain tasks. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the experimental tasks we've been using. So this is the first task, the visual context task, the size perception task, which is based on the Ebbinghaus illusion paradigm, which is quite a nice and robust finding. So basically what you do is you ask the subject, just pay attention to these two center circles. Of these two center circles, which one is larger? So that's where the size discrimination part comes in. So which one looks larger to you guys? Show of hands for this one. Show of hands for this one. Well, it's actually this one. I kid you not. That one's 2 pixels larger than the one on the left. And what happens is these smaller context circles bias the perception of this one, they make it seem bigger. And the larger context round circles make this one seem smaller. Now, the good thing about this task is, if you don't integrate a visual scene, if you don't form a gestalt or a coherent whole, then you're actually going to be better at this task than others. Because you're going to just focus on these 2 target circles and make a discrimination. So here, impaired perceptual organization should manifest as better performance relative to controls. This is another visual task, the visual closure task, which uses Mooney faces as stimuli. Mooney faces are basically photographs of people that are rendered only in shadows and highlights. And, well, can you guys see the face? Well, here's a picture that was meant to make it easier, but obviously you guys aren't schizophrenic because you can do the task. So you need visual closure to complete the gaps in the figure and form this overall gestalt. Now you can't see the Mooney face by local feature detection. For instance, this is just the eye of the Mooney face taken out. Now, if I just showed that to you, you couldn't say, well, this is an eye I'm looking at. But the context provided by the rest of the face, all the configural information, again, raises salience of the interpretation that, hey, this ambiguous item is an eye. It's not like evil Pac-Man pointing off to the left. And this was, so those were the 2 visual tasks. Here's the linguistic task, the lexical disambiguation task. Now, it's basically glorified semantic priming. What you have is you have an ambiguous word. Sorry, first of all, I'll tell you semantic priming. But anyway, if you see a target word that's been preceded by a word that's semantically related to it, then you can be faster to respond than if the previous word was not semantically related. So, for instance, I have this ambiguous prime word ball that I showed you. Now, ball can either mean, dancing, or it can mean round. Now, if you see the word ball, you're faster to respond to the word round than you would be if you see the word ball and then you see the word bigot or twig, or something that's not semantically related. Now, it has a dominant semantically related word, and that just means the one it's most frequently associated with, its most frequent meaning, which is round, and the subordinate meaning, which is dance, and you get this by pre-rating the stimuli. Now, in the way we set the task up, the primary sentence always buys the subordinate meaning. So, in this case, the subordinate meaning of ball would be dance. And we had strong and weak context sentences, and I'll give you an example of this. A strong context sentence, primary sentence, strongly biases the subordinate meaning of the word. So it might be because of the orchestra, they really enjoyed the ball. So it's obvious that ball in this context means dance rather than around, bouncy object. Then you see the word round, and we see how fast they can respond to the stimulus. Here's the same homonym, or ambiguous item, in a weaker context. So because it was a nice night, they really enjoyed the ball. It's still obviously biasing the subordinate meaning of the ball, but less so than the strong context sentence. And we compare your reaction time to identify whether it's, the word round that you see, you have to say, is it a word or a non-word? It's just a lexical decision task. And we compare reaction times to the control condition where the ambiguous word is movie, which is not semantically related to the target. So in a nutshell, I'm going to be brief here, in a nutshell, if you've got reduced context sensitivity, and we hypothesize that's what's going to happen in schizophrenia, you're going to be good at the circles thing, bad at the faces thing, and on the priming, the lexical priming test, you're going to have reduced priming to the subordinate target and greater priming to the dominant target. Why? Because the context of the sentence hasn't biased you towards a subordinate target. So you see ball, it's going to activate everything. So you're going to think round, you're going to think dance, it works. This is just how we assessed how schizophrenic they were. It's just an interview, basically, that I conducted, and assessing on how disorganized they were, either mildly or highly. So experiment 1, 17 outpatients, it's important they're outpatients, from the University of Hong Kong, and we tested them just on the circles task and the faces task. Now it's important to know that these schizophrenics weren't disorganized, they were just mildly disorganized, but they were all I could get at the time. And what we found was bupkis. Basically, they weren't impaired on the size perception task, and they weren't impaired on the visual coding task. So they had intact perceptual organization. Why? Why didn't we find this deficit in context sensitivity? Well, perhaps it was because they were outpatients, so the symptoms were in relapse, and mainly because they weren't disorganized. So what we then did was, we went up to Stratheden and Fife and tested some really highly disorganized incoherent schizophrenics. I'm not saying anything about Fife, but... and the tasks we used were all 3 different context tasks. And what we found was, well, this is a circles task, so you're looking at accuracy on the left, and these are the different conditions. Here, context can help you, it makes the task easier. Here, context makes the task harder. And here, there's no context, so it's just the 2 circles by themselves. And what you see is that when context makes the task harder, schizophrenics are much better than normals. So context hasn't biased their perception of the circles. So basically, they were good at the circles task. This is the faces task. D prime is just a matter of how well you can discriminate the faces. So just think of it as higher the D prime, the better you can discriminate faces from non-face stimuli. And you can see the schizophrenics are much worse at detecting faces. So far they're good at circles, bad at the faces. And this is a priming experiment. And basically the results show nothing really, because the priming didn't work in the normals. The normals, this is just the priming effect. So what you want is a bar going up to show that they were faster to respond to semantically related words compared to semantically unrelated words. And normals weren't. So there was no effective priming. And I'll go into that if I have time, but it's basically because I screwed up the task. I'll talk about that. Here's the important thing. Schizophrenics who were highly disorganized were impaired on the circles task, impaired on the faces task, but okay on the circles task. And all this shows basically is that there's reduced context sensitivity in schizophrenia, but it's specifically associated with disorganized symptomatology. So what does that mean? Well, it's not a general performance deficit, because on the circles task, impaired PO manifests as a performance advantage. It could be a sampling bias. Maybe those schizophrenics in Hong Kong are just high functioning, so I can't rule that out. And of course, there were task differences between the two. One had 80 trials, another had 24 trials. So there are some potential confounds, but if you can forgive them, then what you end up with is this conclusion. Impaired perceptual organization and vision and incoherent speech production seem to be manifestations of a common underlying deficit in contextual processing. And the problem with this is impaired contextual processing affects everything. It affects your self-experience, your phenomenology. So, unfortunately, I have to rush. How many minutes do I have? How many seconds do I have? 0? Okay. This, in a nutshell, is what happens when you have reduced context sensitivity, impaired perceptual organization. Fragmentation. Cognitive, visual, perceptual fragmentation. So this is actually a quote from Schizophrenia, which shows how this breakdown in a very basic low-level perceptual process can lead to just complete, meaningless perceptual experiences that really render them completely incapacitated, to be honest. But unfortunately, to end up very rushed, no, that's all I wanted to say.